Alrighty. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the TED Talk. My name's Ted. Obviously, named the show after myself. And this time, I'm going to be joined by a new guest. Finally, we're not recycling anymore. We've got actually back-to-back new guests that are not players, which we haven't done in a long time. Last time we had Yanko over, and I decided, you know what? From Serbia, we're going to go all the way to Australia to look for potentially even more interesting Counter-Strike opinions. Today, we're going to be talking about Asian Counter Strike, and who better to talk about Asian Counter Strike than an Australian? So I've got elfishguy joining me, of course. For those of you that don't know for whatever reason, you can go and check him out below. He's been a broadcast talent for a long time. You've been a broadcast talent for a long time, Jordan, haven't you?
Yeah, yeah. Well, 10 years, I think. I've
Yeah.
been doing it professionally almost. But I think I started professionally in mid 2016, maybe. But I was doing it
Mm.
as a hobby from 2013 onwards, getting paid at some points in there as well. So yeah, over 10 years in esports at this point.
Yeah, over 10 years of esports. We were just having a chit chat, by the way, about the fact that you are still living in Australia, which makes working in esports for 10 years quite interesting, especially for your cardiovascular system and, your sleeping schedule and all of that. So how are you finding life right now? How's been the last couple weeks? What are the most
Oh,
interesting things happening in your life right now?
going for walks at 1:30 a.m., going for runs at 3 a.m.,
Right.
going to the gym at 3 a.m. Yeah, it's been interesting. Obviously, the major has just completely cooked me. I think the matches started at 1 a.m. and went until 10 a.m. Let's say during the group stage, and then they were
Mm.
starting at about 5 a.m. for the playoffs. So it's been a bit of a hassle, but you kind of get by, and you just got to live that life. And yeah, I mean, like as you say, living in Australia on an esports schedule is obviously not ideal from that perspective, but we were also talking about how nice Australia is to live in. So you kind of have to just make a sacrifice somewhere at some point in your life, and my sacrifice was I don't want to move out of Australia because I really like it here, and yeah, I've kind of committed to staying in Australia. So we'll see if we can, or see how long we can make this esports career go purely living in Australia. It is getting a bit more interesting these days, but the remote work helps.
Yeah, I guess that's what you have going on well for you. I want to actually start this episode by being a little bit. I want to give value to people. I want to be useful to people. So why don't you give your top advice for people that have to work on a messed up sleeping schedule and need to stay
Mm.
awake throughout the night and then sleep during the day? How do you manage? You can give one or two advice. I'm not gonna say anything because I did it for the last 20 days and now I'm in shambles. So I'm not in a position to give advice, but you're making it work.
Somewhat. Look, I have a lot of experience doing that actually, and I think it's also valuable when you're thinking about, like, for example, if you're going to go and work overseas to sort of
Okay.
take this advice. I typically am always someone who likes to try to slowly move my sleep schedule. Like I don't want
Mm-hmm.
to just go straight into it. And I think the biggest sort of most important aspect of it for me when I'm working these overnight shows is, like, for 2 weeks prior, I'll be already starting to like shift my sleep schedule and sleeping pattern. I just think it's a really bad idea to do it
Mm.
in one go or in like a couple of days. You know what I mean? Like if I know that I've got a show in 2 weeks, I'll be staying up 1 hour later each day or something like that, and that certainly helps. And so um, that would probably be the biggest takeaway for me. Plus, I guess getting blackout blinds and a white noise generator or brown. I use brown noise. I think brown noise is better than white noise personally. But yeah, those are my
Okay.
two takeaways.
All right. I
Mm.
actually tried white noise for the first time, I think, like a week ago or whatever. I haven't tried brown noise. I'm gonna
Brown's
check
better.
that out.
Yeah, brown's better. It's like a
Okay.
deeper noise. White noise is like shh, and brown noise is like shh. If
Yeah,
that makes sense. I don't know if that came through.
was the way that I felt when I turned that on and I started falling
Mm.
asleep. It kind of brought me back to the last time I slept on an airplane, right, during a
Yeah,
flight.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
what I thought was going on. I was like, I've been here before. It's just the
Mm.
last time I heard that I wasn't lying. I was just in a seat. Yeah, it's a little bit weird, but I mean, if people can choose not to work during the night, it's probably better. But if you have to do it, you have to do it. My advice would be it's a lot unhealthier than yours. Well,
Yeah.
actually, it is quite healthy. Eat healthy, but then drink an enormous amount of
Big.
coffee, and yeah, 6 coffees per day. That's what got me through it. But it's probably not good for your heart long term. So yeah, don't listen to me on
We're
that
not.
one. Yeah, we're not
No,
we're
I mean,
not doing that.
I just drink tea. I only drink tea. So I'm kind
All
of
right.
cooked when it comes to these overnights. I don't drink energy drinks. I don't drink coffee. I don't do any of that. So that doesn't really maybe help me in the short term, but hopefully in the long term.
I
That's
mean,
the plan anyway.
energy drinks are not great for you either. So it's
Mm.
yeah, I guess it's all right, but it's a bit hypocrite for me to say because I do 6 7 coffees per day when I'm doing that. But yeah, let's talk Counter Strike now. We've gathered up to speak Asian Counter Strike, and in true Asian Counter Strike fashion, we're gonna start a conversation with Australian Counter Strike, and we're gonna start it off with an interesting conversation, at least for me. So I've noticed, which obviously a lot of people have over the course of the last couple of years, that uh, obviously Asia and Australia have the same qualifiers for a lot of the major tournaments, right? And a lot of the big events. And when you talk to Australian people, they'll tell you that they followed Asian Counter Strike because it's all but the same, and then Asians will follow Australian Counter Strike. So when we're talking about, because the main goal of this is to talk about the Mongols, but the start of this conversation should be, when is there a difference between the two regions? And when we talk Mongols, does that include are we putting them in the conversation for Australian achievements as well? So are we comparing them to Renegades, for example, from a couple years ago? Or are we drawing the line right now when Asian Counter-Strike is becoming its own self now with how successful the Mongols are? Or is it Asia was on the train of how successful Australian Counter-Strike was a couple years ago, and now it's the other way around, and now Australia can hop on the Asian train?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really does depend who you ask. Typically, I would say most people in Asia would
Mm,
say that Australian Counter Strike is not part of Asia in terms of Asian Counter Strike. I think most Aussies would probably consider it to be part of Asia. I like to differentiate it by saying Asia Pacific when I'm referring to the region. For example, I know this is a big conversation point at the moment. It's like, is Mongols the first Asian team to make it to a grand final, to make it to a top four, for
I mean,
example?
to a grand final they would be, but top four would be the
Yes.
Renegades, right? Yeah.
Well, technically, like, again, this is where you get into technically, because there was Gamba, which was, I believe, three Kazakhs, and then it's a question of, do you believe Kazakhstan
Uh,
is in Asia or do you believe it's in Europe? I believe
it's
geographically it is technically an Asian country,
it's both
but they
in
play through the
Europe and
CIS qualifier.
Asia.
Exactly,
Kazakhstan's
exactly.
got both. We're not counting that. We're not
So,
counting Kazakhstan and
so
Turkey as Asian countries, I think.
Yeah, so that's where you get into that kind of conversation, and I personally sort of, the way I like to try and differentiate it is that when I'm speaking about the teams,
Mm,
so for example, I would say Mongols is an Asian team. They are obviously Asian players from an Asian region in an Asian organization competing in Asia. That's very easy. But when we're talking about the region, to me, I always say now Asia Pacific, because that is what the region actually is, right? The region is, it's not even really. It should honestly be called rest of the world. This is another sticking point that I have, because it's not just
right.
Asia Pacific. It's actually Asia Pacific plus parts of CIS that we don't count as CIS, plus
Yeah.
plus South Africa, plus the Middle East. So it's
Yeah.
like literally the rest of the world that's not Europe and North America and South America. But anyway, yeah. So I like to say Asia Pacific. I personally believe that that's the easiest way to kind of differentiate it, when you either say Asian or Asia Pacific. Are the Mongols the first Asian team to make top four? In my opinion, yes. Are they the first team from this region in terms of Asia Pacific to make top four? No, that would be Renegades, but they certainly are the first team to make it to a grand final. So, again,
Mm,
it's all about terminology. At the end of the day, I don't think it really matters. I think people just
sure.
like to have arguments, which is kind of what we're all here for anyway. That's what generates content and clicks. So,
Yeah,
boom.
absolutely. Do you feel maybe do you feel some kind of pride seeing the Mongols do well? Do you feel some kind of pride seeing
Yeah.
Asian teams play well, or only Australian teams?
No, 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 no. I think most people would know that I'm a huge supporter of Asia Pacific Counter Strike. Again,
Right.
if we're to kind of continue with that
Yeah.
terminology, my podcast is focused on Counter Strike in that
Mm,
region, purely because, as we've talked about at the start of the episode, time zone wise, it's actually quite difficult for me to keep up to date with Tier One Counter Strike to the same level that other people can. You know what I mean? I looked at
mhm.
myself and I thought, what's the differentiating factor that I can bring to the table in the Counter Strike world? And I thought, I can do Asia and Asia Pacific better than in anyone else in the world. Can I
Sure.
do Tier 1 EU, NA, SA Counter Strike better than anyone else? Absolutely not, because I'm not there. I'm not living it. I'm not breathing it. I'm not on that time zone. It would be much more difficult for me to kind of keep up to date with that than most of the people living over there. So I'll try to differentiate myself by being someone that is an expert on the Asia Pacific region. And so first of all, it's great for me just when the Mongols are playing well, or any Asian team. Lin Vision, shout out to them. TYLOO, shout out to them
Mm,
as well. That obviously boosts my numbers. So there's like that superficial aspect in it that I now have a lot more people that are watching my content. And even we're here talking about the Mongols, for example. I wouldn't probably be here if Mongols didn't make a decent run at this major, for example. So it helps me in terms of people getting eyeballs onto me. But I know a lot of these players. I've met a lot of these players, and I've known them before they did anything of value. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I knew Mongols before they were Mongols. Same for the Limvision guys. I've spoken with Gum on many occasions. I
Hmm.
know the TYLOO guys. Their manager Jack. Probably people don't even know who that is, but I've talked to him
Nope.
for years, for example.
Yeah.
So these are not like close friends necessarily, because
Hmm.
again, it's pretty hard to be friends with people who, first of all, don't speak the same language as you, and second of all, don't live in the same country and actually live a long way away from you. But like we're on speaking terms, and I really like to see them do well. At the end of the day, obviously, I will support the Australian teams first and foremost. If it's FlyQuest versus Mongols, I will
Mm.
always support FlyQuest in that engagement. But beyond that, Asia is like kind of like my second home, in a sense that if it's Linvision or if it's TYLOO or if it's Mongols and they're playing against anyone else in the world, they have my support. So I was co-streaming the major and I was watching all of the Asia games, and it was kind of fun. It was kind of just like a little bit of a Asia watch party. All the people that kind of for whatever reason are um psychotic enough to support Asian Counter-Strike over any other particular region were in there and having a good time. So yeah, I really do enjoy watching the Asian teams. Funnily enough, I'm
Mm.
at the point where I enjoy watching Asian teams almost more than I watch or enjoy watching the tier 1 teams, just because I think I've invested myself so much in those storylines
Sure.
over almost 7-8 years of casting Counter Strike.
Yeah, you've developed your own Stockholm syndrome, which is nice to see. I mean, it's how
Yeah.
I felt with Bulgarian Counter Strike over the course of the last couple of years, when we still had actually teams trying to do something. Now, I guess we have 500, but I'm not gonna go down that path. But uh, yeah, okay. So we are drawing the line. So what we're saying right now is we're gonna focus on, and this is how I want it to be as well, right? Because I think Australia, I think, has always had a little bit more international exposure in Counter Strike in comparison to Asia. Now we're talking continents, we're not talking region wise. So yeah, even though actually TYLOO was the team to make it to the top 16 before Renegades did, but again, if you go back in time, there's a lot of Australian teams that were in there and playing majors before Asian Counter Strike was really on the map. So we're not going to talk about JKS, Gratisfaction, Jacob Mazur, and Lias right now. We're going to start off the conversation with, because you said that you know some of the guys and you mentioned the name of the organization. We're going to start a convo by mentioning TYLOO, because and the reason we're going to mention TYLOO is because TYLOO, prior to the Mongols, was the most successful Asian team. If we are talking about the majors as the main test, for success for those kind of teams. We're going to go back to the Face It Major 2018. TYLOO with Captain Mo, with DD, with BnTeT, somebody in xccurate, I believe, was the full 5-man lineup. Made it into the top 16. Now, this was the first time, and that was the only time up until the Mongols made the Shanghai major top 16 for an Asian team to make. I guess, stage 3 is now how we call it. Before it was just, legend stage, or just the main Swiss of the major. How'd you feel about that TYLOO team at the time? What do you think something made them stand out, made them special in comparison to a lot of the other Asian teams over the years? Do you feel like back then you had the same level of trust, let's say, that now you'd have for the Mongols? Basically, imagine you're trying to explain to a whole bunch of people that got into Counter-Strike in the last couple of years and didn't really watch 2018, 2017, 2019 Counter-Strike, was watching TYLOO as exciting as it is watching the Mongols right now. How'd you feel about that team earlier on, and did you feel like they had some, they had a pretty clear floor and, I guess, ceiling, and they couldn't reach above that? Was that top 16 for TYLOO the maximum, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that was probably as far as they were going to go. I don't know
Right.
if maybe at the time we would have said that. I think back then we would have looked at this TYLOO and thought, well, they managed to make top 16 with a lineup
Mm,
that is kind of like half communicating in English, half communicating in Bahasa or Indonesian,
sure.
and half communicating in Chinese, because there was this whole situation with BnTeT and xccurate being Indonesian and the other three being Chinese, and BnTeT was trying to translate for xccurate, because I don't
Mm-hmm.
think xccurate, super familiar with Mandarin at the time. Maybe still isn't. Yeah, look, I think at the time we thought, okay, this result was really, really cool. Still a fairly fresh roster kind of thing. Give them more time. Maybe they put together something more impressive than what they were able to do. But that never really eventuated. And obviously, Mo and Didi were out of the roster at some point shortly after that. And it ended up being, I think, Summer and an attacker that came in
Hmm.
and that resulted in, still reasonable results, at least domestically speaking, but it wasn't like the same quite on the same stage internationally. So to say they were they as exciting as the Mongols are today, I definitely would say no. I think I'd probably put them more in the bucket of a current day TYLOO or a current day Vision, where you could feasibly see a decent performance and maybe make like a top 16, or you could expect them to go deep in a tournament if the quality of the teams wasn't super strong. Like I think they had a top
Sure.
4 at one point as well in a IEM in Beijing. I can't recall if that was that specific 2018 team or if maybe that was a little bit later on in the piece in 2019. But certainly the core of that roster at some point was able to go deep in certain tournaments, and so they were at the time obviously the most exciting team coming out from Asia, but they're absolutely nowhere near the same stratosphere right now as where current day Mongols are. And I think what really did separate them, in a sense, from the other teams in the Asian region that were kind of doing well, was just that pure firepower, right? Like at the time, BnTeT was considered, and for a very long time afterwards, was considered the number one Asian player or player from Asia in the world. And he went on to go
Yeah.
and play internationally with some North American lineups, and it didn't really work
Would
out
extreme him.
necessarily. Yeah, it was in
Yeah.
Extreme. He was in Gen G at one point. I think probably for me, the pinnacle for him was probably the Gen G roster.
Okay.
That never really got going, but like you could kind of see it at times. But
It's a
yeah, I mean,
bit
he
wild,
was
isn't
definitely
it?
considered.
Just thinking about the fact
He,
that BnTeT played with Automatic on the same team.
I
It's
know, I
yeah.
know. Yeah, it was. I mean, it's kind of like in the same vein as the machine gun to splice move, which was just like who thought that was going to work, but. Um, Yeah, look, I think there was a few X factors in that lineup. BnTeT obviously being the number one Asian player in the world at the time. He was just like an insane fragger. Like he had very, very sharp mechanics. And xccurate as well. I think people kind of forget a little bit about xccurate
Hmm.
when we're talking internationally. I think fans from Asia still remember, people still remember xccurate and Kaze as the two probably at the time, like guys that were like pushing it forward as far as AWPing was concerned for Asia. And xccurate, I don't know, he had a bit of a not a fall from grace so much, but I think his career just had an abrupt end after this TYLOO
Hmm.
stint that kind of just took him out of people's like zeitgeist, if that makes sense. He at the time though was definitely a conversation for best AWP in Asia with Kaze. And you can go back and look at some xccurate highlights and you think, wow, this guy was really something special. Because especially back then, AWPing, you could do a lot more, I think, than what you could do today. It was, a little bit more of like a mobile thing for him. He was a very sort of flashy AWPer. You weren't punished as hard. The flashes weren't as good
Mm.
from teams. They couldn't punish AWPers as well. So he was someone that really was able to pull off some pretty impressive and special rounds for TYLOO. So I know it's funny to say, like, because obviously it's a Chinese organization, but the two Indonesians for me were kind of like always not the heart and soul of the team necessarily, but like they were like the X factor of the team. And then I thought Mo and Didi, and obviously we know what somebody is up to. Somebody was kind of at his peak at that time as well, just
Yeah.
being an absolute brainiac in the server. So yeah, there was a lot of like fun to be had with that TYLOO roster, but I think you could look at the way that they played and the way that they got their results, and you could say this is probably not sustainable for the long term in terms of being a best team in the world candidate. Whereas if you would look at the Mongols and the way that they play and how intelligent they are, and even again like their
Mm.
individual skill as well, is on that level where you could look at them and say, well, I think they're very comfortably a top 5 team in the world. Whereas TYLOO were, I believe, the first Asian team ever to make top 10, but it was only for, a week or a couple of weeks
Yeah.
where that ended up happening. So,
That's an interesting thing for me. First of all, I'm gonna refer to what you said about the heart and the soul of TYLOO, because that was what it is, right? For me in general, because I started watching Counter Strike around, let's say, 2016, maybe 2017, around that time period. So TYLOO, as you can guess, was the first team that I got introduced to that was a little bit more successful coming out of China and out of the Asian region. BnTeT was talked about like a genuinely maybe top 30. I don't want to say top 20, but even at times top 20, but top 30 mechanical player in the world, right? I still remember there was that wild thread that I've always found hilarious. Someone on it must have been HLTV. It couldn't have been Reddit because I don't really read into that, but someone called BnTeT the Indonesian simple, which I or
right.
the Asian simple, which I found really really funny at the time. And then it turned out that in Asia, he had that reputation of being good with all the weapons and he could play all the roles. So that's why people just called him ultra skilled, you know. And he was a great player. He was incredibly well versed. For a lot of people that have probably just seen him play on Extremum or haven't even seen him play at all, it's a bit of a shame because he was an exciting player. But as you said, the thing with TYLOO, it felt like it was a lot more, the firepower has always been there, but it's been always a lot more driven towards the firepower, and the tactical aspect was lacking a little bit. Don't you find that a little bit precarious though? Because when we're talking about the Asian, Asian general as a continent, then we look at other esports. Asian players have always really been really good at strategical games, right? They have pretty quick thinking. They're quite practical, quite shrewd. But no matter what they're playing, League of Legends, Dota, even in Valorant, I think they're pretty alright. But we're not talking about that game. We're talking only about real esports. So. Isn't it a little bit surprising that a region that is usually notorious for having high intellectual players was actually lacking in the tactical department in Counter-Strike and was only good in the mechanical one?
I think it was a bit of a stereotype that kind of developed over the years just because
Sure.
purely from teams like TYLOO. Also, if you want to shout out to another sort of fairly notable
Mm,
Asian team, the original MongolZ roster, if you remember like the Machine Gun Zilkenberg roster, like those
yeah.
guys were absolutely
That was the one that
insane
maaRaa
in
played
terms
on,
of
right?
correct. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And
yeah.
they were very, very solid, like mechanically speaking, but that's kind of where it fell flat. So you had a few of these like notable results from those kinds of teams, and people kind of just sort of lumped that into a bit of a region stereotype. And it wasn't wholly untrue necessarily until, some more recent times, I would say. So I don't know that it's necessarily a huge surprise. I mean, when we're sort of drawing those parallels to other games, Counter Strike's
Mm,
obviously something which has quite a tenure, I suppose, as opposed to let's say something like a League of Legends, for example, which is maybe a little bit younger in a sense,
sure.
and that's where you kind of get like the Koreans. Like the Koreans were always, I think, generally speaking, held in pretty high regard in terms of their strategic play, even in Counter Strike, because they had been around for such a long time. That core of like the MVP roster, like the
Hmm.
Solo, Termi, Bale, Glow, Zeph, those kinds of names. They had been playing back in Source and 1.6 and whatnot. And I think you just kind of need to develop that what's the word, like general base understanding of how a game operates or how a meta operates or what have you. That a lot of these players that were coming through in global offensive early on in the piece hadn't necessarily had the opportunity to do, or at least hadn't in the eyes of the international audience had the opportunity to do. And it was also partly just due to the fact that they were worse, like they were just worse. So
Mm,
people were like, well, they must not know how to play the game quite as much, and that's fair enough. Like you don't get exposed necessarily to the best players in the world, best teams in the world. So you're probably not quite as sharp in that respect in terms of the strategic aspect. So I think part of it was definitely true when it came to Counter Strike. I don't think it was an unfair representation, especially in those early days, and especially when we're talking about again, like you can see how easy it is to make that argument. A team that barely spoke the same language. Like, what
sure.
else are they? They're not going to be making crazy mid round calls. They're not going to be doing anything too outrageous in the server. Like they're going to be calling out a spawn, they're going to be defaulting, they're going to be thinking extra if you could get a pick or two in mid mate, that might really help out our round. And that a lot of the time was what ended up happening. And that is a lot of the time what ended up getting them their wins. So at least for that TYLOO roster. Plus also, by the way, you've got somebody on that roster. So he's about to do something outrageous. So yeah, it was very easy to I think for people to say that when you look at the way that TYLOO played back then.
Okay. So we're going with there always has been some other restrictions, or well, not always, but especially to a team like TYLOO that kind of limited them to relying a lot on the
Mm.
individual skill, which makes a lot of sense, right? It makes a lot of sense for the communication part of it as well. I guess a lot of people probably, at least for me at the start, I remember just a couple years ago, I actually found out that TYLOO's players didn't, well, were not speaking the same language for whatever reason.
Mm.
I thought they all knew Mandarin, right? And they were just chatting
Yeah.
Mandarin and everything was all right. I'm glad you mentioned maaRaa's name though, because he is the one that I want to start a conversation with when it comes down to the Mongols. Because obviously the Mongols, as this project is a little bit newer with the core, but this project originally started from IHC, and this is where I want to start this conversation because for maaRaa and bLitz, the coach and IGL duo, they started playing together in 2022, and obviously they already had played a couple majors, right? The first one was the Antwerp major in 2022, which they qualified for, and that was in the first coaching year of maaRaa's career after he retired as a player. So once IHC entered the scene, did you already know something about maaRaa as a player, as a coach? Have you had you followed him before, or that was the introduction part of it all? And if you had to describe the guy as a coach, what would we go for? What do you think? Why do you think he was the one that was in the core of building that type of a successful project? And when I say that, those are my words, by the way, because I do think maaRaa is in the core of building that project, but I think most people should be able to, I guess, agree to some extent, especially when we're talking about the duo of himself and bLitz. But yeah,
Mm.
him being 35, pretty much the dad of the team. And the interesting thing for me is the fact that he started his coaching career fairly recently, like 3-4 years ago, and he's already doing quite a good job. So yeah, what do you think about him when she saw him first take on IHC as a coach?
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely the GOAT coach of Asia, isn't he? Like,
Okay.
there's no real argument about that at this point. You could even, I think, we were sort of talking about this on Geographically Challenged, have him in a conversation for, maybe Coach of the Year last year or even this year.
Okay.
It's probably going to be hard to beat some of the names in the likes of Vitality and Mouse and whatnot at this stage. But
Mm,
at least as far as what he's been able to do with the core of players that he's got, like that's a pretty special achievement, I think. But again, I'm a little bit biased towards Asia. Now, one thing that I will say is that actually it does go back a little prior to IHC for this roster. If
okay.
you know the name Checkmate, there was a team called Checkmate from
Okay.
Mongolia, and this is where bLitz and Techno and maaRaa first sort of linked
Right.
up
That was
as well. So
2021, wasn't it? That was 1 year after.
correct, yeah,
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
Or before.
So
Yeah.
so when you ask were they kind of on the radar, I guess
Mhm.
before they came into IHC, I would say to an extent they weren't really super successful necessarily in that Checkmate roster, but this is obviously very sort of early on in their careers. I
Mhm.
think Techno joined that team as like a 15-year-old as a sub at one point, and that's kind of like how he ended up
Right.
sort of actually getting a core position. So you got to think about that as being like super, super early on in their career. But that is the point at which they kind of grouped up together. And so, yeah, coming in as IHD, I can remember the Road to Rio Asia Pacific RMR, which was back in 2022. I was casting that one. That was
Mm.
back in Melbourne, and I specifically remember giving my predictions for that one. Um, and that was after they had qualified for PGL Antwerp, which was, I
Sure.
think, the first time that this team had qualified to a major. But
Yeah.
I still had Rare Atom and at the time the Greyhound roster. So this was
Mm.
this was this was like current day TYLOO and current day FlyQuest as my two favorites for that event. It was a 4-team event. It was IHC, Rare Atom, FlyQuest or Greyhound, sorry, and Gigi Hao, which was the Middle Eastern representative. And everyone knew
Sure.
Gigi Hao was quote unquote the worst team. It turned out I think that Rare Atom ended up coming last because they got knocked out by Gigi Hao in a PO3 somehow. But yeah, I had Rare Atom and Greyhound qualifying there. So I think, I didn't really have them on my radar as being a top team in Asia
Mhm.
probably until 2023, which is where they had then gone back to back at Asia RMRs and been the first place team. I think I had a lot of like leftover, not nostalgia necessarily, but like leftover vibes, I guess, from the dominance of Chinese and Australian Counter Strike in Asia for such a long time. Because if you would go back in the history of RMRs and miners and um, whatnot, you would see a lot of the time it was Renegades and TYLOO or TYLOO and Vici qualifying for these kinds of
Yeah.
tournaments to go to majors. So I kind of still looked at it as like, okay, this team from Mongolia, they're good, like they're doing things, which is kind of cool. But are they going to be able to beat like this established, you know, quality, I guess, that we had
Mhm.
from Asia, from China, and from Australia? I didn't necessarily think so. I also thought at the time, I thought this Rare Atom team, which is now TYLOO, was going to be the best team in Asia, and I still kind of like to this day think they should be better than what they are. But that's a whole nother discussion point.
Okay.
But yeah, in terms of my expectations for this team, I didn't necessarily expect that they were going to be as good as they are, and certainly not as good as they have been. But I think yeah, maaRaa's influence is something that it's kind of hard to quantify again because obviously again
Okay.
like obviously we don't speak.
Yeah.
He speaks Mongolian, I speak English, and it's hard to like look at this team and say, as with any coach, what is his impact really? But I think you do have to just kind of look at the pieces that he's got in terms of a very, very young team across the board, a very inexperienced team across the board, internationally and even domestically at the time, and the the quick rise that they've had. How much of that do you put down to bLitz being like this prodigy of an in-game leader versus maaRaa being an exceptional coach? I think you kind of just have to kind of at least give both their flowers in that
Mm,
respect, and say there must be something that maaRaa is doing right, even if it's like even if he's not some tactical genius and that's all coming from
okay,
bLitz. That's a potential angle you could take, but
sure.
he's doing something to keep this team in good spirits, to work the mental, to do whatever, like all those outside the server aspects of coaching. I'm not necessarily saying that is all that he does, but there is definitely something that he brings to this team that would you get from another coach if you just copy paste? Like, could you put Machine Gun or Zilkenberg or Togu
Hmm.
or any of these other old names like into maaRaa's position and get the same result? I would say at this point, especially probably not. Now that he's got all of that experience under his belt, but even early on in the piece, I think he must have been doing something right. So yeah, I think he deserves a lot of credit personally. And the reason they
Hmm.
wouldn't stick with him if he wasn't a good coach. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
they're at the point now where if they could get a better coach, like there's certainly people out there that they could find even potentially internationally, and work with someone on an English speaking basis because these guys can understand English and you could get a translator involved. So if he was no good, like he would have been gone, but he's obviously still there. So something's gone right for maaRaa.
Yeah, I mean, look at G2. They know how to get rid of a coach that's not really helping, and I'm sorry, I just had to include the slander in there. But yeah, I do agree with you on that one. What do you think the Mongols have done? And I'm gonna ask that question as we're on the Mara conversation because I think obviously, if we decide to take that entire angle of him being, how much is it? 12 years older than bLitz, who's the oldest
Mm.
one on the roster. Um, if you decide to take that angle, then we could look at maaRaa as that type of a father figure, maybe on the team to some extent, right? So you could imagine that he's taking part in a lot of the important decisions on what the approach towards the game should be. The preparation process, how people had to strive to be more professional when they got into the team for the first time, and helping everyone else get acclimatized to playing on a higher level. So, what are the things that this MongolZ team for you over the period of the last couple years did differently in order to extend their, I guess, process of gradual improvement, where a lot of the other Asian teams a couple years ago and in time have failed? What are the MongolZ doing better, and where did they find success where others failed?
I would say probably the biggest thing for this Mongols outfit was their ruthlessness with the roster, right?
Okay.
Like I don't think you see that many key roster changes in a team as what
Mm-hmm.
we saw in the early days of IHC in other Asia teams. Again, Asia Pacific, if we want to bring Greyhound, for example, into that discussion,
Mm-hmm.
they were always very much a team that, they were very friendly with one another. So I think it was very difficult for them to cut people. And you would see them maybe make like one change a year, for example. And it was always
Okay.
like there's this one guy on the team that you kind of like knew was going to be the next player to get removed at some point, but it almost like you can take the Alistair discussion for example,
Mm-hmm.
into the early days, but now you're starting to see, for example, with the Dexter removal on FlyQuest, like that ruthlessness may be starting to come through now that they're in the FlyQuest organization, and that ruthlessness is something that the IHC roster had from kind of the beginning. Like they were
Sure.
not shy about making roster changes. Same for Rare Adam slash TYLOO slash the Vici Core, which was the Mercury, Jamyoung and Mosaic Core,
Mm-hmm.
they also didn't tend to make roster changes. They played with Advent and Kaze for a very long time, and people again were kind of looking at that and saying, "Well, if this is as far as you're going to go with this roster, you probably need to be making changes if you really want to see an uptick in results." And
Sure.
it took them 3 years to get from that Vici Rare Atom core to where they are at now, which is again looking like a bit of a quote unquote Chinese super team that maybe didn't quite come together in the way in that major that we thought that they would. So there's a lot of teams I think that you can look at in Asia that haven't made those changes,
Mm.
even though to the outside perception they kind of needed to be made. Whereas Mongols and IHC were a team that made changes before you even thought about. Like we would look at the changes that they made and go, "What are you guys smoking? Like
Yeah.
you're on something special here. You're removing. They removed score, dude. This was
Yeah.
this was like the most prodigal player out of Mongolia. People were like, he's insane. He's the best player in Asia. And then Mongols are like, nah, we don't want him. Annihilation got removed.
Mm.
Again, people were looking at him and they're like, this is like the best AWPer that we've ever seen at the time, obviously. And Cabal got removed as
Yeah.
well. Cabal, a very, again, obviously he's kind of
Respected
besmirched
name.
name
Yeah.
with the whole match fixing thing. But
Yeah.
at the time, he was very respected and
Yeah.
he was a tenured member. He was, I think, a founding member of that IHC roster. Not of the checkmate roster, but he
Yeah.
was definitely in there early in IHC. He was considered a veteran. He was considered like a really, really strong presence in that lineup.
He
He
played
got
with
removed as
maaRaa on that
well.
original Mongols, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
he was around. He was around early as well. So, they've made a lot of those changes. There was a few that they were kind of like a little bit more obvious in the sense like people were like get rid of like Hastika, for example,
Okay.
and those kinds of names. But not even just the removals, not even the changes that they made in that respect in terms of removing players, but the additions that they also made were kind of like surprise additions. I think Senzu maybe less so because we knew a little bit more about
Mm-hmm.
Senzu just from some of his previous outings. But players like 910 and mzinho, if you were not Mongolian, you'd literally never heard those names. And I'm someone with my finger on the pulse of Asian Counter Strike, more so than probably 99% of people in the world. And I had never heard of 910 and mzinho when they got added to the roster. So
Okay.
that made it even more of an outrageous thing. We would look at them. I can't remember exactly who was removed for 910 and mzinho, but you look at the names that they removed and the names that they ended up with, and you look at it on paper and you go, that's a moronic decision. But obviously, Mongols knew better, or someone in Mongols knew better, and presumably that would be the brains trust of maaRaa and bLitz and maybe Techno as being like that core trio that this roster
Mm.
has maintained over the course of checkmate into the Mongols. And yeah, I mean, I think that is probably the one big differentiating factor that they had that is very easy to recognize that is a not in the server thing
Okay.
where it's like, oh, who's doing the calls, who's making the decisions, who's doing this and that. That very much easily you just look at that and go, well, that is one key difference between them and other teams in Asia because you look at
Mm.
how good some of those roster changes ended up being, and maybe how good some of the other roster changes that were made in Asia around the time as well ended up being. For example, Regali coming into FlyQuest, he's been an insane individual. What would that have meant had Greyhound had a player like that 2 years ago, for example? Don't know, but they will never know, obviously. Whereas Mongols and IHC made those roster changes ruthlessly at times at the beginning, even after having really
Mm.
good results, and it's worked out for them. So
Could you say that Renegades did something similar when they picked up Jacob, and before that with some of the other international signups they had? Obviously, Nav played there for a little while as well, because that's an interesting. It's an interesting way to look at it. It's honestly for me, it's crazy when you think about it, and you're like, well, the only thing or one of the main factors that was stopping Asian teams of progressing further was just their own, lack of I guess willingness to make the right decisions or make the hard decisions, I guess you could say. If for example you've played with someone for many years but you need to remove him in order to get that young prospect. But yeah, there has been a couple interesting signups. In my head, I've always wanted to believe that maaRaa was the one standing behind the scouting and making decisions like the 910 and mzinho transfers, because obviously for bLitz and Techno was a lot easier because they were already together, as we pointed out. I want to shift the conversation a little bit towards 910, and I think he's going to be one of the most interesting people to talk about on this team in particular for a lot of people. Now, everyone knows that obviously in the major grand final, when now we're going to have to start mentioning all of that as well because we're going to be talking about recent form as well. In the major grand final, especially on the second and third map, he wasn't necessarily there when they needed him as much, right? He had a bit of an off day. He did play well on map one though, and everyone else did, I guess you could say. But I think, in my eyes, and I'm going to refer to something that Yanko said, but without naming the name of the other operas. But I think 910 is actually better than a lot of the operas that we see on tier 1 Counter Strike nowadays. And I guess, again, as you said, and I'm going to go into that group of people, I had no clue who that guy was a couple years ago. When they picked him up, I just opened HOTV. I'm like, MongolZ 910. I'm like, okay, cool, don't care. I don't know who the guy is. I just keep scrolling. Didn't even open the article. I was like, I have no clue who the man is. I just opened up. I saw that he was a teenager at the time. I was like, okay, or he was 19, 20. I was like, he's played on Clutch, he's played on D13, he played on Born in Mongolia. I've never watched any of those teams, so it was really difficult to form an opinion. But now, after watching him for a couple years, I guess at this point, and a couple months, a little bit more, the one thing that I've noticed with this guy, and this is a reoccurring topic, and the reason I'm saying this that early on is because I think we can just put it out there because it's something that you could say for the entire team. He's gradually becoming better and better. And I don't mean individually. Individually, I think he's sick. And individually, I think he was sick the first time I watched him. I think he's sick the second time I watched him. He's still sick individually. I think he is improving in terms of the way that he's dealing with pressure, the way that he's not going AFK every single time that there is an important matchup, because this is a point that you can make nowadays for him. He's still a little bit inconsistent, but a lot of the time he's starting to find consistency in important games a lot more often than he would, let's say, 1 year ago or 1.5 years ago. And for a lot of people to say that, he is one of the problems on the team, I guess, is something that I've seen on social media. But again, it's a wild place to look for Counter-Strike opinions. He had his year best rating at Dallas, played really well. The Mongols lost a really close series to Vitality. Then at the major, he was without a doubt one of their best, if not their best player. If it wasn't for Senzu, he would have been their best player for the entire major. And he just had a little bit of a slow, I guess, game in the final against Vitality, but you can't fault him for it. Would you want to? And this is my question. I'm not gonna ask you what your opinion on the guy is, because I think he's pretty sick. Of course, you can tell me if there's any specifics or stylistics that you want to go in depth with. But would you want to see this guy pursue international Counter Strike? Because I think if you're a team like, I don't know, Liquid, and you're notorious for giving chances to people that don't even have any prior tier 1 experience, why don't you give a chance to someone that doesn't have any international tier 1 experience in terms of, playing on an international team, but has played on this level and can punch really hard? Would you not want to see this guy try and play on a top 10 team that is not the Mongols, if, of course, the Mongols can't sustain their top 5? Because as long as they sustain it, I don't think he leaves, right? But if they don't, maybe he can find a way out.
Yeah, look, I mean, I guess the simple bias answer is no, definitely not, because then that means
Sure.
he's not going to be playing on an Asian team anymore. So there's that little level of bias involved for me. But if we're in this, let's go into this theoretical world where MongolZ is not a good team and
Yeah.
they're not getting their results. I think 910 definitely is someone that you could look to port into an international team. He's certainly shown the ability. I was the same as you when I first watched him play. I thought, I've never heard of this guy. What's he going to do? I think if you would scroll back to like his very first sort of match in the Mongols, I believe one of the first games that he ever played was on Nuke internationally, and I remember this round where he like came up the vent and like got a double kill on the
Right.
A side or something like that with the AWP. And I was like, oh, okay, this guy's like actually like he's talented. You know what I mean? He's not just someone out, because there was this love affair with Annihilation back in the day. Everyone was like, man, get
Right.
Annihilation back into the Mongols. Everyone wanted to see because he's a very flashy AWPer. He was great with the
Yeah.
Deagle. He was super exciting to watch. So everyone wanted to see Annihilation back. And when people picked up when Mongols picked up 910, they're like, "Oh, this is who's this guy? Like, couldn't be better than Annihilation." But I think what 910 brings to the table is generally a very sort of stable force in this Mongols roster. You can say obviously he did fall off a little bit in the grand final. There was 2 matches, but that's against the best team in the world and potentially an era-defining team. So
Yeah.
how much slack can we really give him for that one? But generally speaking, he's not like an outrageous AWPer necessarily, in the sense that when we look at the makeup of this Mongols roster, you have a very aggressive rifler in Senzu, and
Mm.
at sometimes a very aggressive AWPer in Senzu. He's just that kind of guy. He likes to be on the front foot
Yeah.
to his own detriment at times, I will say, but that's his role in the team. And even like bLitz, I think, likes to be kind of on the front foot as an in-game leader. He
Yeah.
likes to make some moves around the map as well. So I think you do kind of need someone that's a little bit more reserved in that sense in 910. He's not like the most passive AWPer necessarily, but
Mm.
he's certainly not Annihilation in the sense that he also wants to be like, he doesn't want to necessarily be him in the server. You know what I mean? And I think
Sure.
that is a really nice fit for the roster. So I think that's where he kind of like fits really nicely in this Mongols lineup.
You know what's the interesting thing about what you're saying, Rod? I don't think this Mongols lineup would need him to be more aggressive than he already is. In fact, one thing
Right.
that I looked into, because again, I had the pleasure of watching pretty much every single MongolZ game this major from start to finish, he was trying to go for a lot of opening fights, in particularly on some maps, right? Even if you want to look at, and this is a fun memory that I have engraved in my head, but on that Mirage that they completely annihilated Vitality on, and ZywOo was absent and whatnot. ZywOo actually shut down 910, I think, 3 or 4 times in the first half without having an AVP. He had an M4 and killed 910 either through a smoke or in a weird timing or whatever for an opening kill. But the reason I'm saying this is not to pick on 910. The reason I'm saying this is every single time 910 got shut down in those plays, he was trying to make an opening on the T side. So I think he is trying to create a lot more initiative. And as you said, the complicated thing when you're an oper on a team like this, it depends on who you're playing against, obviously, right? You want him to, he can't go for opening fights all of the time on CT or on T side because he's got, as you pointed out, aggressive riflers as Senzu and bLitz, and bLitz is the IGL as well. So he's got people that like making moves around him. The good thing about him is I think he shows willingness, and that's what sells me on him, by the way, because I love aggressive opers. I'm all for that shit, even though, Cirque didn't used to be the most aggressive oper in the world, and I'm a Bulgarian fanboy, so I can defend him until the end of my life. Well, maybe not now, but back in the day. I think the reason that I'm sold on 910 is because he's showing me understanding on when he's supposed to make aggressive moves with the AVP. When he knows that, for example, he's T side, he knows that the CTs don't have money for an OP, he's gonna run up top connector, try and peek. Or run up short and try and peek connector towards ticket, right? He's gonna be going for those, or he's gonna try and go BFs for an early pick. He's going for those plays when he knows that he's in a position to punish. Maybe he's not going to have the confidence to do that when he knows that ZywOo's, on the other side with a big green and he's 20 and 5. Maybe then he's going to be a little bit more passive and play on refrag. But I think for me is the intelligence of seeing that he can be aggressive if the team needs him to be. What he's comfortable with, I don't really care about, right? It's because there's gonna be opers that are more aggressive, there's gonna be opers that are more passive, there's gonna be hybrids. It's all up to the person. Until he goes out and says, I'm more comfortable doing that, I don't know what he's more comfortable with, right? Because the team might require him to be playing a certain type of Counter-Strike. But it's about looking at the macro and looking at the fact that when he is set up for success, he's gonna go for those plays. When it's logical, he's gonna go for those peaks. And this is the one thing that I really like about him. I think he is developing as a player. I think he is really progressing as a player. And in case you haven't figured out, I am an opers guy, and I love talking about the style of an oper. But yeah, I think 910 is. I think he's sick. I think he's really sick. We're gonna navigate the conversation now because I want to say a couple words about every single player without making this a 3-hour video. But we're gonna navigate the conversation towards bLitz, and we're kind of going up and down with how we started with the coach, and then obviously went into the oper. But now I want to talk about the IGL a little bit because I think, and you're gonna tell me if you agree with this, I think this guy is one of the most underrated in-game leaders there has been in the last couple of years in professional Counter-Strike.
Yeah, I mean, probably. I think, and again, that's potentially a holdover of that old sentiment around Counter Strike in Asia, just generally speaking, being all aim, no brain. They don't really
Yeah,
know much about the game, this and that. We don't necessarily expect Asia to even be good or even competitive in some instances. So the groupthink moves slowly, I would say, is probably the way to sort of conceptualize that discussion. But yeah, bLitz is definitely, in terms of his impact on Counter Strike in Asia, a bit of a legend or a bit of a prodigy, right? Again, how much can you put down to bLitz? How much can you put down to maaRaa? Well, at the end of the day, bLitz is the guy in the server that 9 times out of 10 is making the call. Although maaRaa does have a pretty good track record with the timeouts. Like I think he's generally able to convert on a lot of those rounds. So there, I think, is a
yeah,
lot to be said about that duo that they do work really well together. Yeah, bLitz is honestly, I think he's a bit of an enigma even to people who are following the pulse of Asian Counter Strike, just because
sure.
he's a very soft spoken person. You know what I mean? Like you've seen him in interviews, and that is, that's partly because he's speaking in English, and he's obviously not super comfortable speaking English. But as far as I know, he sort of keeps himself pretty closed off. He's not a super sort of public facing kind of a guy. You can even see it by his like mannerisms on the on the. Yeah, he's doing the little finger tap thing instead of like high fives and fist bumps. He's not super outgoing. He's not really making a lot of noise. So he's not maybe like the loudest presence, and I think that is part of the reason why people maybe don't necessarily focus on him as much in this
Mm,
lineup as they would do maybe the likes of a Senzu or an mzinho. Mzinho is very lovable. Like you just look at
Okay.
that guy, like I love him. Whereas Blitz is, he kind of keeps a bit more of a lower profile in a sense, and so that I think is part of the reason. But I mean, he's phenomenal, isn't he? Like, there's got to be something about this guy that just makes him an X factor. Like
Right.
no other player in Asia has been able to take a team to this level. Certainly not with such young players, changing the roster so many times and still having some success. You think about again, like all of those roster changes that we talked about. He's been here
Mm.
since IHC. He's qualified with Cabal and Annihilation and Score in the lineup, and he's done it now with 910 and mzinho and Senzu as well, and all of the teams in between, all the players in between, the Hastakers and whoever else was in that lineup at any given time as a as a quick sort of temporary fix. So he's kind of been able to do it all. I believe earlier on in his career he wasn't actually the IGL. There was times where again like Hastika I
Okay.
think was IGLing at some points. But he's certainly sort of taken that mantle and kind of run with it. So yeah, he's an X factor, and to maintain his bragging presence as well as an in-game leader is really impressive too. He's been one of the more standout riflers in the lineup for pretty much his entire tenure. So across the board, don't really have anything bad to say about bLitz,
Yeah.
except I'd kind of just like to hear more from him. You know what I mean? Like I'd
Sure.
love to delve into his mind and maaRaa's mind, even if it was in Mongolian and someone was able to translate it to English. But they don't really do interviews. You know what I mean? Like so, it's kind of hard to like really get an idea of who they are, especially if you're not Mongolian.
Yeah, but it's kind of, you know what? I find that pretty interesting. I think that entire element of it's almost like mystery around this team is actually what
Intrigue.
makes it so intriguing. Yeah, yeah, it's really intriguing. I think the fact that you don't really know a lot about the players, bar as you said, mzinho, because he does. I think he does like what 80-90% of some of the interviews. He's always the one jumping in content and showing that he's genuinely a really hilarious human being, right? He's quite likable. But I think for the others, because for example for bLitz, you look at him, this guy joined the team when he was a teenager, and as you said, he hasn't always been the in-game leader. But for a 23-year-old, he's already one of the best frag and IGLs out there. He is a top 4,000 chess player in the world, which is actually quite impressive, right? He's an
Yeah.
intelligent and quite a tactical person. So I guess this is a cool reference you can make. This is one I was making a couple years ago, I think, when I'd say that for me, Counter Strike actually resembles chess a lot because it's all about, you have some set openings and you have some moves, and it's all about trying to predict how your opponents would react to some type of a move that you're making and all of that. And he's been showing that I think I think he's a tactical in-game leader in the sense that he is quite dynamic with what he does around the server. So if I had to compare him to someone else, internationally from tier 1, I'd say maybe an Apex. I see that working out because he's that
Yeah.
type of a space taker. Obviously, Apex doesn't get that much freedom anymore. Sometimes he does, but I'd say he's a really proactive in-game leader that's really good on the go. And that
Yeah.
is the reason, as for him and many other players on this MongolZ team, that I actually think he could, if his English is on a high enough level, make a good career internationally. But I almost don't want him because I think
Yeah.
he's really vital for the Asian region and for Mongolian Counter Strike in particular.
Yeah, no, I mean, those were 2 points that I was going to make as well.
Sure.
What I appreciate about Blitz is that he is someone that can kind of get it done himself if the
Hmm.
situation calls for it. So I think that's kind of been quite a positive aspect to the Mongols, not strat book necessarily, but playbook. Let's just say that he can be a bit of an enforcer if he needs to be.
Yeah.
And then on the other side of the coin, yeah, Blitz. The question that you asked about 910, would you want to see him in an international team? I think if I wanted to see anybody, if I had to choose someone,
You
kind of
say
try and
Blitz?
ply their trade internationally, I probably would say Blitz because
Okay.
to me that is actually a a bigger indication of what you can do as an in-game leader is to do it out of your comfort zone, right? Like it's
Hmm.
one thing to do it with your countrymen in the language that you speak and whatnot, but like if you were able to do, like, let's say you were able to do maybe in a sense what Carrigan does with an international team, picking all these pieces from all over the place and being able to make that work. Does that not then indicate like you're just even on a bit of an extra level? You know what I mean? I look at what, for example, Dexter did
Sure.
from Australia, right? Like, and you talk about best in-game leaders from Australia and whatnot. It's like, well, we're comparing him to maybe Azza, and Azza typically always did it in his comfort zone with local players.
Okay.
Yeah, there was some international talent in some of his rosters, but they were always Australian teams. But Dexter went into MOUZ and he went into Fnatic and he took MOUZ to a top four at a major as well. Is that do you take more value out of that than what you would in a domestic team? I think in a lot of instances, I actually take a little bit more value out of the international rosters, which I don't know is necessarily what everyone's opinion would
Mm.
be, but I think there's definitely some element to being put out of your comfort zone. So, were there a situation where a player was to play outside of Mongolia, in 5 years' time, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
if MongolZ is not performing, if there's not enough talent in Mongolia, could bLitz, assuming he spoke English well enough, transition into an international lineup? I think that could be pretty cool to see what he might be able to do. But I think it would be very difficult for him at this point in time, just from a English speaking standpoint, because I don't believe that his English is on that level yet to be
Sure.
a good enough in-game leader in an international team. Now that may be wrong. My read on that may be wrong, but just from the interviews that I've watched of him speaking English, I don't. First of all, don't think he's super comfortable,
Sure.
and also I don't think his English is that strong. So I think you would see a pretty dramatic drop off in terms of what he would be able to do in terms of mid rounding and strat calling and stuff like that if he was doing it in English as opposed to in Mongolian. But certainly somewhere down the track, I think it would be maybe cool to see. But yeah, I'm more than happy for him to stay in Asia as well, quite frankly. So no arguments from me there.
You know what's the thing with those guys, and the reason that I'm actually a little bit counter some of them leaving. I think even culturally, even if they do speak English well enough, let's pretend we live in a universe where bLitz has got, I don't know, an English degree. He's got a PhD in
Mm,
English, and he's fantastic. He's got no issues with communication, with thinking in English, and any of that. I still think culturally there might be a bit of a difference in maybe even the work ethic and the way that he sees some types of conversations should be taken. And obviously, this is just guessing, right? But this is a phenomenon that I've noticed with some other players that are coming in from a background where you've had to spend 5, 6, 7 years playing domestically and then go into
mm,
international Counter Strike. Not everyone can do that, right? And there is a clear reason that not anyone can do that, because you get used to a certain type of thinking. You get used to certain type of conversations and way of taking them, and then once you go out and play international Counter-Strike, and you gave Karrigan as a great example, someone that is playing with people from all over the world and different nationalities, different backgrounds and whatnot, you need to be really good at being the, I guess, mediator of conversations, and you need to be really good at accepting that everyone's going to be doing things in a
mm.
different way, and just finding I guess the middle of it all. And I'm gonna do that again, by the way, because obviously Bulgarian, and I'm gonna keep making that reference. But because every time I get to shout out Cirque, I will do so. But for example, I think the reason things worked out for Cirque and things worked out for some other players that left their countries early on to play international Counter Strike, I think the reason they had success is because they left early. It is because they didn't stay to make a name for themselves in their own region and then leave in a couple years. And it's a little bit different, let's say, if you're North American, because you do speak English. So I don't think it makes
Right.
that big of a difference. You can learn a little bit more. Maybe the culture is not going to be as different. But let's say we're talking about, I don't know, if we're talking about Russian players, for example, why didn't who could we give as an example? worldEdit go and play international Counter Strike when he was 30, right? Why
Right.
didn't those guys go out? Because I think you get even a little bit, I don't want to say complacent, but you get too used to the working process. So I honestly
Yeah.
would love to see bLitz internationally. In the same time, I would appreciate if he stays there, because I think this is where he can showcase his potential, given that he's got good players around him.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting thought, isn't it? Because I don't think that we've ever really seen an Asian player go and play in, and obviously there's players who are ethnically Asian. Let's just make that distinction. But
Yeah, I
that were
mean, we're
coming
not
from the
counting
Asia
Stewie
region.
2K as an Asian player,
Yeah,
right?
exactly, exactly,
It's
exactly.
yeah,
That's my point. But people are
yeah,
gonna be like, "There's so many Asians." It's like,
yeah.
okay, bro,
Automatics
come on.
won a major.
Um, yeah, yeah. Anyone that's come from the Asia region,
Hmm.
unless I'm forgetting someone super obvious,
Yeah,
but I don't think we've seen a player from Asia go and play in an international lineup and really have a great degree of success. The
yeah.
two notable names would obviously be BnTeT and Machine Gun.
Hmm.
And I think that's kind of it. To be honest with you, like
Oh,
there's almost
Komi
the reverse
Su. We
effect.
we gotta throw in Komi Su
Yeah,
there,
but
right?
he's the
Yeah,
reverse effect. He's gone
yeah.
from North America back to China and had more success in China than he did in North America. So, yeah, I don't know. Like, I think it would be cool to kind of see that.
Mm,
That sort of conversation happen because we
sure.
certainly have seen it from Australia. So I think you might actually be on the money here a little bit. Again, Australia, in terms of a cultural perspective, is probably quite homogenous with like North America and even
Okay.
even a lot of like Western Europe, for
Yeah.
example. You can kind of like slot in, and we typically tend to get along culturally with most people. So that's where you see some of that success coming through for players like JKS and like even
Mm,
for example Ricky, if you go back in the day, had a pretty decent career in North America. Those kinds of names, but we haven't really like seen that. I mean, BnTeT did okay when he was over in NA, but it wasn't. You know, his clearly his best period, his peak period was in that TYLOO roster. Whereas you can't really say the same for JKS or for Ricky, for example, in terms of their careers playing domestically versus
yeah.
internationally. So yeah, I mean that could be an interesting concept. Maybe it will be one of these MongolZ guys. But I think it would be hard, particularly for bLitz, if he wants to maintain being an in-game leader
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, being an in-game leader is a little bit more difficult, even if you are a vocal rifle. I mean, a good example is
Mm.
Tenier, by the way, from Heroic, because he's a bloody beast, this guy, and he's a future top 20 player.
Yeah,
But even with him, you
definitely.
could see that in the first couple of months he couldn't be as active around the map, and now he's getting a lot more active spots. But we're not here to talk about Belarusian Counter Strike. We're here to talk about Mongolian Counter Strike. We're gonna keep the conversation going strong with Senzu. Now, the reason I wanna keep it going with him, and we're gonna obviously give mzinho and Techno a shout out as well towards the end, because they are the supportive elements of the team that get oftentimes left out of the conversation. Techno had those amazing clutches against Vitality. He's the Mongolian Magics at this point, just saving everything up for the major final. But Techno, I think for me has been a revelation, and the reason I say that, I know he's been pointed out as the big talent, and you said that it was not shocking when they picked him up because he's been one of the
Yep.
superstars of the Mongolian region. The reason I've been impressed with this guy is because I think now, same as 910, he's growing into being more consistent. I'd say that he's more consistent than 910 at this point, and I think at this point he's growing
Mm.
up to the point where he realizes that he is the star of the team, and the point where he is able to deliver in big games, and when everyone else is struggling and things go into shit, he is stepping up and making the difference. I'm going to give that G2 game as a reference on Dust 2, even though that was one of the ugliest maps of Counter-Strike I've seen in a long time, team-wise.
Mhm.
He was the one guy that said, hold on a second, I know we should be beating those guys. I know it's an important game that we should be winning, because this G2 team is not in a state where they are even remotely close to the level that we should be bringing into the table. Everyone is struggling. The game is scrappy. I'm going to take the initiative. He broke the record for the most amount of kills in regulation in a major map. He finished the map with above 50 kills, I think 56 or something like that. And he single-handedly carried them through and won enough time for guys like bLitz and 910 to wake up. So the reason I am really impressed with this guy after the major is, just to summarize it a little bit, I think he's showing that he can put on the big boy pants whenever the team needs him to.
Yeah, most definitely. And I don't know that he was quite as much of a surprise as 910 and mzinho. He obviously came in, he's like
Okay.
the last addition to the
Yeah.
MongolZ roster. He came from this NKT
Hmm.
team, and if you're familiar with Asian Counter-Strike, NKT
I
is
mean,
or was
we will
a bit
just
more of
open
an
it up.
international team.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were like a bit of an amalgamation of different names. You can see in there BnTeT, obviously best player from Indonesia, Zine, best player from Korea, or
Mm.
only player from Korea at that time,
Yeah.
unfortunately. RIP Korean Counter Strike. You know, you had a bit of a mix of Mongolian talent in there. Aircast was playing there at one point. Gratisfaction was playing there, apparently playing there at one point.
Yeah.
Um, this is a really weird team. Like they're just a mix. It was kind of like the leftovers. Like if you couldn't find a team in your domestic region, or if your domestic region didn't have enough good players, in the case of like BnTeT and Zyme,
Sure.
for example, this is almost where you ended up. And so we'd seen him in this roster, and we could kind of like see. Obviously, he's not had a good game there for whatever reason, but we could see that he was a
Oh
pretty
yeah, we're
talented
not
player,
we're
like
not looking at
mechanically
the
speaking.
old 31. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but that team was absolutely cooked, so I wouldn't really necessarily read into it too much. But we
Yeah.
saw the talent as an individual, you know, and mechanically speaking, people were quite high on Senzu during that NKT era. Coming into the Mongols, obviously expected him to be domestically very good.
Hmm.
We knew that he could hang in Asia, but obviously how would he go internationally was a bit more of a question mark. But yeah, I mean, he's certainly been a revelation. He's one of the big reasons why. Like it feels I I feels kind of like they've sort of settled on a golden five, if that makes sense. Like you almost
Sure.
have a domestic equivalent of a prodigy in every given role
Hmm.
in this Mongols, and that's quite easy to obviously say in hindsight now that they've done really well. But Blitz is potentially the best in-game leader we've ever had in Asia. Probably is, maybe not even potentially. 9,
Yeah.
10 certainly up there in discussion for best AWP out of Australia. People are going to go, oh, xccurate and Kaze back in the day were really, really good. But like, I don't think you can argue with 9, 10 at this point, just in terms of the level that he's been able to achieve. Senzu
I
in
mean,
terms of
have you ever
aggressive
thought?
riflers.
Have you ever thought that an oper from Asia could have a place on a top 10 team before? Realistically, not just looking at some highlights and saying, "Oh, he's hitting
Well,
incredible flicks."
that's the thing.
Realistically,
That's the thing. The rose tinted glasses do hit pretty hard, mate. When you're looking at some extra highlights, you go, "Shit, this guy could have been simple." But yeah, no, like obviously, that's a fair point.
yeah.
I mean, Senzu in terms of the aggressive rifler,
Mm.
mzinho in terms of anchoring, Techno in terms of his supportive elements and roles, and what he was able to do as well. He's had a bit of a fall off of late, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But
Yeah.
all five players in this lineup feel like they might be like best in class, or at least like in a top three discussion, for example, for
Okay.
Asia. So again, he's a bit of a prodigy. Like same thing as what you can say about bLitz in terms of his role. You can say about Senzo in terms of his
Mm.
role. I don't think we've seen a aggressive rifler have the same impact internationally as what Senzu has had. Certainly, there have been riflers domestically that have just
Sure.
been absolute freak shows. I mean, look, you could go and say, well, where would you line him up in terms of a matchup with like the names like BnTeT, for example? And it's like,
Okay.
well, he certainly eclipsed BnTeT. Like, there's no doubt about that. And he's
Yeah.
still so early in his career as an 18-year-old
Yeah.
that he can really only, as you could only assume, could get better with time. And now on top of that, you put into the discussion the fact that he essentially didn't choke in the playoffs, which was always his only downfall. Like he was always really good in group stages.
Mm.
That was the reason Mongols were always such a reliable team to make it to playoffs, was that this guy would drop like 1.3 or 1.25 in a group stage. Like it was no one's business.
Mm.
And the fact that he can now do that in playoffs basically means like he is definitely up there in conversations for top 20 riflers of the year. Like he was in a conversation last year to be a top 20 rifler of the year internationally, and we've never had an Asian player really in that conversation. Like you said with BnTeT, maybe people would
Yeah.
float him, but it wasn't necessarily really there. People would float JKS, and that was a conversation point. But Senzu's a bit of obviously a different role than what JKS is, and so he gets his ports a little bit more. So I think by the end of this year, we will see Senzu in the top 20, uh, assuming the run from the Mongols doesn't just completely fall off a cliff and people get the recency bias. But certainly in the first 6 months, he would be in the top 20 riflers of the year. So that is something that is very unique in terms of Asia because we've never really
Okay.
seen that before. So he's got to be given some credit in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I am impressed with the guy as well because I think he's got some maps he's playing anchor positions as well. I'm not really sure. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I think he's got majority on the maps that he is playing anchor. I think it's like uh big bomb side anchor. I don't think he's got any small
Mm.
bomb side anchor positions, but I hope I'm not waffling right now, but I looked at it I think yesterday or the other day. The fact that you can put him in, I don't think he's your traditional type of guy that's gonna go and have 30% entry attempts on T side as well, which is good because bLitz does the majority of that work as well, right? And Techno's got some aggressive plays, but I think it's actually good that Senzo's not the one that needs to go in first every single time, even though he is an aggressive rifler. It kind of sets him up to be the pack rifle, and that's where I think he does some of his best work. Even though he is an aggressive player by proxy, but
I
yeah,
mean, he can AWP too, which is
yeah,
a conversation point in and of itself. Sometimes I'm not such a huge fan. I think there's a bit of a pushback in some senses against Senzu AWPing just purely
mm.
because he is so solid on the rifle traditionally, but we often see him take a secondary AWP role on the CT side, and
Does too,
he's
works
definitely
out
got the
well. He's the
talent.
mid player.
Yeah, does too Mirage as well.
Yeah,
He likes to pick it up on Mirage. I think we have seen him AWPing a little bit on Anubis as well on CT side here and there.
yeah,
In situations where he can either pick up 910s or he can take a secondary
okay,
AWP. It can work definitely for this
mm-hmm.
team. I think the way that it is utilized sometimes does make you a little bit scared just because of the economic aspect of it. But That's another element to his play that is not spoken about a huge amount, but he had it previous times been AWPing in
Okay.
his career, and he's certainly doing it still quite well here in the Mongols. So yeah, he's a very well-rounded player.
All
I mean,
right.
you can put him in a lot of positions and make it work.
Okay. Techno 4K. Talk to me, baby. Why
Mm.
why is be
I
why
agree.
is he why has he been struggling? Wow, I had a mouthful with this one, but yeah, why is he struggling right now? And was he
Mm.
just saving clutches for the major final against Vitality so he can have one of the
Maybe.
sickest highlights of his career?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's no secret that he's obviously not any longer playing, the roles as that you might want necessarily, right?
Sure.
Like he's often the guy that's just sort of out on the flank. We've seen it all the time in the Austin Major.
Mm-hmm.
He's pushing out of the B bomb site, for example, on Anubis, and he's just like kind of sitting outside B main while the rest of the guys on CT side are like working as a pack, and he
Mm-hmm.
potentially in that situation just gets absolutely banged out and dies. But he's holding space on the other side of the map. He's doing the same thing on the T side. And he's had a bit of a fall off individually just in
Mm-hmm.
terms of his no, I mean the mechanical level, I guess, is probably what you would say. He's just not shooting as hard as what he was maybe 2 years ago, and that's kind of all well and good, to be honest, because when it matters, he did show up in the playoffs and in the grand final, even on Mirage there. So yeah, he did have a bit of a fall off, and I
Mm-hmm.
think there was even starting to be conversations and rumblings of do they replace Techno, which would have been unthinkable 12 months ago. But I think he's probably done enough with this playoffs run in this grand final to just hold on to his spot in this lineup. Also, not to mention the fact that when you look at Mongolia again, it's very hard to kind of from the outside go, well, there's an immediately a better
Mm-hmm.
look or a better team if we pick up this player or that player, because I think the talent in Mongolia is obviously such a step down from the Mongols that it's
Sure.
very hard to say this player will definitely make the step up to the international level. Like you can look at them on a domestic level, say like someone like Zeralt, for example, really,
Okay.
really cracked out player domestically speaking. Could he come in and play techno roles and do well internationally? Well, who really knows at this point? Like it can be really, really hit and miss, and we've seen that with a lot of players in the past where you take that step from playing domestically to then playing internationally, and it takes quite a long time. So I personally am a big fan of techno, always have
Mm.
been. As a core founding member of this roster. Also, by the way, just like an absolute G of a human being. Like he's the guy that I have the most conversations with in
Sure.
the Mongols lineup. So he's just like not like a close friend, but like I would consider him to be friendly. I would be a
Okay.
friend of his. So I like to speak highly of him, and it was kind of difficult with the run that he had been having. But I think you look at the roles, you look at the situation that he is in that team,
Mm-hmm.
and the results that they're getting as a team, and you'd have to look at that and say, do you really want to be making a change here when things are still trending positively for the Mongols? My personal take was no,
Mm.
specifically after the events that we saw in Austin. I think there's even stronger of an argument in that direction. So yeah, just a big fan of techno in general.
My big question is not should the Mongols be making changes when they're winning. My big question here is if we had to, I guess, forget about looking at the pure statistics. Considering this guy again, all of the things that we mentioned, the fact that 910 is not the most aggressive oper, but he's still requiring space and he's still going for aggressive moves, and you've got bLitz and Senzu on the same team. The fact that everyone else feels comfortable and the team is winning, doesn't all of
Mm.
that mean that Techno's doing his job?
I would say so. Yeah, I mean, I would say you look at other players in his position and in his role, and kind of compare numbers there, and then it becomes less of a conversation point in my
Yeah,
opinion. I think he's just a bit of a glue player, and I really respect that from him because in previous iterations of the Mongols, he was a bit more of the guy. You know what I mean? Like he was a bit more of a fragging element, I guess, in this roster.
sure.
But now he's taken a bit of a step back. He's obviously someone that has that tenure in this lineup, and he has recognized that he can give that space to the younger guys, to the Senzu and to the 910, and to an extent to bLitz as well, and just sort of take the L individually
Yeah,
for the good of the team, and respect, man. Like someone's got to do it, right? So
yeah.
shout out Techno one time.
It's really wild that we are saying letting the younger guy step in, and he's 20 years old.
I know. I mean,
it's
but hey,
absolutely.
Senzu's 18, so
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
what are you
no.
gonna do?
Yeah, it's wild because you're right. It's wild because you're right. But yeah, if you had to give an example with Vitality, for example, you look at Messi, right? He was a star before. He can't be a star on Vitality. It doesn't mean that he's not doing his
No.
job and he's not playing well. So I guess we could say Techno's the Mongolian Messi. Maybe. I don't know. Yeah, last one that we're gonna talk about here is mzinho, and then we're gonna have a couple words about what we make out of this major, and we're gonna round it out. But
Mm.
Mzinho's been he's been, I guess, same as Techno individually, maybe not the most impressive, although he's not struggling as much as his teammate. But yeah, tell me a little bit more about this guy, because I think before he joined the Mongo, same as 910, I had no clue who Mzinho is, and even now I am struggling to paint a picture in my head onto what type of a player he is, bar the fact that he's absolutely hilarious as a human being, as we said. And
Yeah.
he seems to be all right with sacrificing himself for the team quite a lot.
Yeah, he's Bartak's younger brother. So that was a
All
big
right.
storyline that was prevalent when he
Yeah.
first joined the Mongols, because I think he replaced Bartak, and it was kind of like you get replaced by your
Oh
younger brother.
yeah.
It must
Yeah.
not be a great feeling. So I think in a sense there must be something in terms of him having been around CS for a very long time in his life. If his older brother is playing in the Mongols, you can imagine mzinho would have been competing and playing CS as a young kid. I've seen a few photos, I think, of him, as a really young kid, like
Mm-hmm.
9, 10 years old, sort of like playing lands or something. That may have been Techno or Blitz or whatever. But I'm sure, my point is that he's been around the game for a very long time. And even if we
Sure.
didn't know him, I'm sure that he was someone that was at least reasonably known in Mongolia and in Mongolian CS, just purely because he was Bartak's younger brother.
Mm.
You see it, like, for example, it happens all the time in Asia for some reason. If you know xccurate, his younger brother Forsaken just won the Valorant Masters in Paper X, like
Yeah.
literally 2 days ago. So, and he was supposed to be like that next prodigy in Asian Counter Strike for Indonesia until that Paper X roster moved from Counter Strike to Valorant. So anyway, rip that. But I think mzinho, someone like that, where people would have kind of known him domestically speaking, but we obviously didn't really have much of an idea of who he was. And so someone saw some talent in this guy, or saw the ability to mold him, and this may be a relevant discussion for both 910 and mzinho,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even to an extent Senzu, all three of them kind of like joining the Mongols very, very early in their career and playing international Counter-Strike from like basically like day dot, in a sense. Like this was
Sure.
their first like proper legit good team. So they essentially come into a lineup where they are, forced to play the best teams in the world, forced to learn and grow in that environment. And I think that may be to their benefit, in the sense we're looking at 910 as someone who didn't have a lot of hours in Counter Strike, still doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
The meme about him having only 4K hours. I think he might have another account on the side. But like these guys
I
are
hope.
essentially forced to kind of like grow and live in that environment, and I think
Mm.
that really levels them up a lot quicker, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to if you bring an older name in and they've already got all these preconceptions and this pre-knowledge from playing shithouse domestic Asian Counter Strike where it's just garbage all the time.
Okay.
These guys never really had to go through that in the same way that a lot of these other players did. And when mzinho joined the roster, I mean, there was no sort of, I don't think anyone makes a secret about the fact that he was not looking too hot. He
Sure.
wasn't super hot to trot. It took a little, like probably a good at least 6 months for him to really start to find his feet in the lineup, and probably not for the first 12 months until people were like, oh, okay, he's actually good.
Mm-hmm.
So they stuck with him. They recognized that there was some talent there, and that's again, I think a tick in the book of maaRaa. But
Okay.
mzinho, yeah, I think he's a super solid player. Like, I think I appreciate the stability that he brings to this roster. And again, what do you really have to say bad about mzinho? No, he just plays his roles. He plays his roles pretty well. He's a
Mm.
good character in the team. Positive. I think he's a very positive influence on the roster as well.
Sure.
And so, yeah, he's a solid guy in the team.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna hit you with a big one right now. Will the Mongols make another tier one LAN grand final this year? Was what we
This year,
saw at the
this year
major a
definitely.
fluke?
Yeah.
They will?
No, they're definitely not a fluke. I mean,
Okay.
If you would ask
I
me,
mean,
are they going to make another major final this year? That's a different conversation. But
sure.
tier one land, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I say a fluke, I don't think them beating Pain Phase, G2, Envision, and Liquid is a
Mm.
fluke, or could be considered a fluke. But do you see those guys making a grand final of a big event if they have to play a Vitality, if they have to play a Mouse, if they have to play a Spirit? An Aurora
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
is a little bit more doable, but yeah, can they stick around with the top dogs? Do you reckon?
Or Falcons. I mean, they're worth a conversation point
Yeah,
too,
yeah,
I
yeah.
suppose. But yeah,
Almost
no,
forgot about
I think we did see enough from the Mongols here to say that they have made a little bit of a step. I mean, the way that we
Sure,
like to talk about this on my podcast, and we sort of heavily discuss this particular topic,
sure.
not in the frame of will they make another
Mhm.
high placing, but more so have they kind of like broken. We talk about glass ceilings for the
Okay.
Mongols a lot, where they every sort of 6 months they break through this next glass ceiling. So like they, for example, when they started playing internationally, it was just make playoffs, right? And they were then starting
Mm-hmm.
to consistently make playoffs. So they broke that glass ceiling. And then it was like, okay, can they make a top eight at a major? Can they make a top four at a major? So they broke the top eight at the major at Shanghai. Now the next question was, can they break top four at the major? Well, they broke top four at the major. And in doing so as well, they also broke that glass ceiling of playoffs choking. Now, I guess we have to ask ourselves if that is going to be a one event wonder. Is that going to be a one hit wonder? And they're going to
Mm.
regress back to the mean in the next, season, for example. Obviously, that's possible. I think it's unlikely. I think now that they've managed to sort of break that mental barrier or that glass ceiling, for example, they will be a team that will be a genuine contender in these
Sure.
playoffs. I don't think there's any argument that they're not going to consistently be making playoffs. And again, to imagine that they're not at some point over the next 6 months going to have another favorable bracket that could at least get them to a grand final just purely by being a favorable bracket, that feels like it's very possible to me already. But even if we disregard that and say, can they beat the likes of Vitality, Spirit, Mouse, Falcons in, let's say, a quarterfinal, should they get matched up
Mm.
against those teams? I think we saw enough in the grand final and in the playoffs here from the Mongols to make an argument that
Mm-hmm.
on their day, they could beat one of those teams. Look, on their day, look, let's say Vitality has a bad day. If we play Mongols versus Vitality that we saw in Dallas, it was at the group stage, the
Sure.
game where Mongols lost 13-11 on Inferno. If that match happens again today, where the Mongols were looking so good in the playoffs and Senzu wasn't choking and whatnot, could you say the Mongols definitely will not beat Vitality every single, like if we run that simulation 100 times? Like I don't think you can say that Mongols would lose every single time. You know what I mean?
Okay.
That's my argument here. It's like and if they can beat those guys, can they beat Spirit? Can they beat Mouse? Can they beat Falcons? 100% they can beat those
Mm.
teams on their day. Are they the favorite in those matchups? I don't know that I'm necessarily going to go so far as to say that, but could they cause
Okay.
an upset in those kinds of games? 30-40% of the time. Yeah, I think that's very, am I coping? Am I Asian CS bias? I don't know, you tell me, but that to me feels like a very real possibility that they could beat one of those teams in a quarterfinal or beat one of those
Yeah.
teams in a semifinal on their day. You know what I mean?
I think it is realistic. Yeah, it's kind of going back to what bLitz said before Navi went up against Vitality in the quarterfinals, right? He said he wanted to know that Navi could beat Vitality in 1 out of 10 potential matchups. So then there is at least an opportunity. And if you can imagine a team beating someone 1 out of 10 times, that means that they can take them down pretty
Yep.
much, under the right circumstances in a really important event. They can take him down. And yeah, I can imagine the Mongols taking down everybody else. I think the only reason that I don't see them taking down Vitality, maybe in a group stage, yes. I think in playoffs, a team like Vitality at this point just has enough character to bring back pretty much every single
Oh, for
game.
sure, for sure.
Also, there is something specific before we talk about how much they, what the Mongols just did means for the entire Asian region. The one thing that I want to hear your opinion on, why do you think it happens that often? Because that's a phenomenon that I've noticed with those guys. They oftentimes start really well. They play incredibly streaky Counter-Strike. They have a 7, 8, 9 round lead, and then they struggle. So it's kind of similar to what I think the Vitality game is a great example, but even the group stage game against Face Clan, where they started 7-1 on T-side engine and then ended up losing the map, winning only 10 rounds in total, is a good example as well. They oftentimes seem to get going and then they look like one of the best teams in the world, and then something just happens and they stop and they fall apart or they freeze. I don't know if this is something that only I have noticed, or it's my mind just playing tricks on me. But I feel like a lot of the times those guys ride the momentum wave really nicely into getting a big lead, and then
Mm.
everything just stops going their way. And this is a repetitive thing. Now I know it comes down to specifics, and we have to be quite practical when we talk about this and say, well, there's this factor and that factor in this specific matchup that caused it. But I think with them it happens quite a lot.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, if I actually knew the answer to this, FlyQuest would be one of the best teams in the world, because they
Okay.
suffer from the exact same problem, right? Where they're going to go up like 12-3 or something like that and then still lose the map. And you're like, you guys just looked like such a sick team. You looked like a top
Mm,
20 team in the world. And then you didn't even look like you could hit the broadside of a barn. So I don't know that there's necessarily an easy answer here beyond, well, obviously MongolZ is a very young team. First of
okay.
all, again, we have to remember that these guys are still probably one of the youngest teams in Tier 1
I
Counter-Strike.
mean,
I
they
don't
are the
think that they
youngest
are
team to make
anymore. They are
a
still?
major final ever. So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. So, like remember what you were like at 18 or 20. Like, bro, come on. Like
Please
this
don't
is
take me back
the,
there.
the stresses the stresses and the pressure that these
Yeah.
guys are going through compared to me working as a fucking deli assistant in a supermarket,
Okay.
is it's on another level, you know what I mean? And you might have a mental breakdown because you have to take the bins out at the end of the night, but these guys are
Okay.
playing in front of thousands of people on the stage. So there's that element, obviously.
Okay.
I think as well when it comes to the Mongols, like they still have some work to do in that psychological aspect,
Mm.
as do probably many teams.
Okay.
We've spoken at length about the possibility or the need maybe for the Mongols to have a sports psychologist or someone to help them out in that respect. From my understanding, it's not actually easy to find that in Mongolia. Like it's not a practice that is particularly valued
Okay.
in that country, in that culture. And again, that again may not be 100% factual, but that's just based on what my fans have sort of like told me, essentially, like the guys in Mongolia that watch my stuff are sort of
Sure.
indicating. So I don't know that it's necessarily super easy for them to find someone that can do that in Mongolian, and they have tried it in the past, and it hasn't necessarily done a whole lot. So yeah, I think it's just a process of trying to like kind of work through it. The other thing is sometimes they just make weird decisions in the
Mm-hmm.
server individually,
Sure.
right? And I think that is an easy fix. Like if you go and look at some of the rounds that they lost on Ancient to FaZe, for example, there's that one egregious one, the 4v2, where Senzu's
Yeah.
playing Temple and 910's playing Donut, and Senzu is holding the line from Temple with the orb, and then for some reason he walks out big box in a 4v2, and it's like,
Yeah.
why are you even doing that? That's just him as a player making that decision, you'd assume. And I think that's where he just needs a little bit more experience in these kinds of environments to go, the percentage play here is to not walk out big box. And even if he does do that because he's someone that wants to be on the front foot and that's his role in the team and that's
Mm.
okay for him to do, then 910, why are you then just walking in the middle of the open in Donut?
Yeah.
And those kinds of mistakes seem to just compound upon themselves. Like when one thing goes wrong for the Mongols, then those kinds of things start to pop up. So it's about trying to find a way to mitigate that being something that happens for the Mongols on a, let's say, reasonably consistent basis. Every sort of, maybe once a tournament, for example, this kind of thing will pop up. So I don't think that's super difficult to fix. I think, probably those players know better. They'll look at that and go, well, I shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
But then why did you do that? So that's really all I think a lot of that takes, is that once that starts to go wrong, you then don't lose the stupid rounds and have it go egregiously wrong in the same
Okay.
way that you go from a 7-1 to like a 7-10 scoreline, for example. So fix that, and potentially you make games a lot easier for yourself on the Mongol side. And whether that's a psychological thing or if it's just, I don't know, like you surely these guys know better. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it must be some kind of mental thing. Like it has to be. There's nothing else that it could be because they know what to do, and they do that
Yeah.
a lot of the time. So it has to just be something mental.
I mean, yeah, they are professional players. There's no way you're gonna play them a clip and they're gonna tell you, oh yeah, that was the right play. They know
Right.
better than us. That's the at least this is the good thing. You know they should on paper know better than anyone that's watching the game and not playing, and they definitely do.
Mm.
So that is why we're looking for the reasons, right? That's what makes it so interesting. Final thing that I wanna discuss, and we could make this brief, but I guess it's my favorite topic of all of them because I think this is what makes the entire run of the Mongols so exciting. The fact that we haven't had an Asian team do what they have just done now before. Is this how the Asian region comes back strong into Counter-Strike? Are those the types of results and phenomenons that make 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds say, I want to become those guys and I will start grinding the game? Is this the foundation for Asian Counter-Strike to be successful 5, 6, 7 years from now?
Well, yes and no.
Mm.
I think definitely the case for Mongolia. Like
Okay.
you've, I don't know if you saw that on Reddit. There was some clip of some 3-year-old playing CS or something like
Right.
that, and like obviously he's awful, but like these are the kinds of guys that turn out to be mzinho in 10 years time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in Mongolia they've definitely captured the zeitgeist. It's
Yeah.
insane. You've obviously seen
And the clips from
the watch parties and stuff
Yeah.
like that. Yeah, it's insane. They are like again. I've been talking to some of the guys that watch my content, the Mongolians, and they're like, there was a guy that was like, I was at a watch party and there was this girl sitting next to me that I literally didn't even know anything about CS, and I was like literally explaining how the game worked and
Yeah.
who Vitality were and stuff like that. I'm like, how is this? Like this is unthinkable in my country. I'm sure in most people's countries that some, like, let's say like some 15-year-old girl is going to watch Counter Strike if she's never had any interest in video games in her life. Like where is that coming from? So that's the kind of cultural phenomenon that the Mongols are
Yeah.
in Mongolia. And to imagine that that's not going to have some knock-on effect down the track for Mongolian esports and Counter-Strike specifically is unfathomable. Think about the way that SK Luminosity
Mm.
influenced, like, you see those pictures of like
Yeah.
Fallen and Snow,
Snow
for
and
example.
Fallen. Yeah.
There's gonna be Blitz and fucking whoever the next guy is from Mongolia in 10 years, where he's had a photo with him as a 5-year-old kid or
Yeah.
something like that at one of these. Like there's a Mongols homecoming party, I think, this week somewhere in Ulaanbaatar.
Sure.
So no doubt there's going to be some kids there that are going to be, I want to be the next Blitz, for example. So
Mm.
100% for Mongolia. And I think it does have positive effects and impacts on just the current state of Asian Counter Strike, where we're looking at Mongols essentially giving an extra slot to the region. Lim Digital have
Sure.
obviously done the same as well, and that is inherently beneficial for China, for Australia, as the two kind of like major other sub-regions alongside Mongolia in Asia. But even some of these Middle Eastern teams are going to be looking at that and thinking we have a crack and that kind of thing. To say that it will bring Asian Counter Strike back in terms of Asia as a whole, I don't know that it has that same impact necessarily
Sure.
for Korea, for Japan, for Southeast Asia, like Indonesia and Vietnam and Thailand. Like all these regions used to play Counter Strike, but they're all Valorant now. So what MongolZ is doing is really fantastic for the teams and players and the ecosystem that's currently invested in Counter Strike and
Mm.
maintaining it. But I don't know that it is going to bring anyone back necessarily, because people are going to look at that as being unreachable, right? If you're
Sure.
from Indonesia or Thailand or Singapore, let's say, like for example, like can you feasibly look at that and say, I think I could be what the MongolZ is without even having any domestic scene in my country? Like it
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't. I don't think that really tracks, unfortunately. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe at some point down the track there is like one prodigy or something that comes out of Singapore as an example,
Sure.
and plays on an international team. But I don't know that it's going to bring back the whole region necessarily. But certainly, it doesn't hurt. Let's just say that.
Yeah, yeah. At least it will be inspiring to some extent, especially knowing, for example, 910's story and how he used to travel with the train, not having enough money if he loses at the land that he's traveling to
Yeah, yeah.
actually get a hotel room or travel back home. Those are the things that I think could inspire some of the kids coming out of even poorer backgrounds, right? And more
Hmm.
difficult countries to thrive in as a Counter Strike player in Asia. But yeah, hopefully it does. That's the one thing that I'm hoping for. The one thing that I'm hoping for is that we can go into Asia and take it right back from those Valorant bastards and just convert it to a Counter Strike continent, which would be nice. I mean,
That
we
would be
can't
my dream.
we can't take League of Legends out of them, right?
No, no, no,
We can
no.
let them have League, but at least when it comes down to the FPSs, we can screw Valorant and just take Japan for example. I don't know, and at least
Yeah.
we've got Mongolia. Mongolia is based, but
Yep.
that will be all. Thank you very much. It's been 1 hour and 30 minutes. Wow, I even didn't think that we went into detail too much on a lot of the topics, but I guess this is Asian Counter Strike, and I guess this is why Geographically Challenged has some 2 hour episodes. you know quite well. But yeah, folks, hopefully you enjoyed that conversation. Shout out to Jordan for joining me on this one, and obviously you can go and check out Geographically Challenged, which I think had a new episode released like 24 hours ago or something like that, and that was definitely an interesting one. So you can go and check it out. Now it's off season, so you can spend all the time that you want in the world just watching content and watching podcasts and listening to people ramble about Counter-Strike and pretending that they know what they're talking about. At least that's what we're doing on this show. So make sure you subscribe, you follow, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one. You can find Jordan's links below, same as Geographically Challenged and everything else, and we'll see you again soon. Bye bye.